Alexander Bychkov, a career criminal turned soldier, found himself crawling through a Ukrainian forest, bloodied and broken. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and decay, the silence shattered only by distant artillery fire. His body was battered, his spirit teetering on the edge of collapse. But as he clawed through the mud, one question loomed over him like a specter. Was he a victim of circumstance, or an accomplice in a brutal invasion? Captured during a failed operation near Bakhmut, Bychkov tells his story as though he were a reluctant participant, a pawn swept up in forces beyond his control. He speaks of coercion, promises of redemption, and an unshakable desire to reunite with his estranged daughter. Yet, beneath the surface of his carefully curated narrative lies a far darker truth, one of complicity, moral decay, and the devastating human cost of the war he helped wage. To understand Alexander Bychkov's story, one must first grasp the machinery that placed him on the battlefield, a system fueled by propaganda, coercion, and the exploitation of society's most vulnerable. The war in Ukraine did not begin with Alexander's capture. It began long before, with a carefully orchestrated campaign to rewrite reality. In the years leading up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the state media crafted a narrative of existential threat. Ukraine was portrayed not as a neighbor but as an enemy, a proxy for NATO, allegedly intent on dismantling Russian sovereignty. This narrative, repeated endlessly on television and social media, transformed neighbors into foes. For citizens like Alexander, who spent most of his life in the shadow of state propaganda, these stories blurred the line between truth and fabrication. Over time, they created a worldview where violence became not just excusable, but necessary. When the invasion began, the Kremlin turned to unconventional recruitment strategies to bolster its ranks. Initially relying on conscripts, they soon sought out prisoners and other marginalized individuals, presenting them with a grim bargain. Alexander, a repeat offender with a long criminal record, found himself caught in this web. The Russian state offered prisoners a Faustian deal: fight for 6 months in Ukraine and walk free. For many, it wasn't a choice. It was a mandate. Bychkov, already marginalized by his criminal past and desperate to reconnect with a daughter he had barely spoken to in years, signed his name on the dotted line, hoping for a fresh start. This decision, however, didn't occur in a vacuum. It was emblematic of a broader societal apathy, a resignation to a system that thrived on fear, manipulation, and control. The Russian public, fatigued by decades of authoritarian rule, either accepted the government's narrative or chose to look the other way. Fear of reprisal silenced dissent, and a steady drumbeat of propaganda drowned out voices of opposition. This indifference created the perfect environment for the militarization of society's most vulnerable: prisoners, impoverished workers, and conscripts who believed they had no other option. For Alexander, his entry into the war was a desperate act cloaked in promises of redemption. He may have seen himself as a victim of circumstance, but his choices placed him on the front line of an invasion that would devastate countless lives. Whether he was a pawn of systemic coercion or a willing participant in the machinery of war is a question that remains at the heart of his story. A question his own words will struggle to answer as the narrative unfolds. What did Alexander Bychkov truly experience on the front lines? His account paints a picture of chaos, fear, and survival, but it's riddled with contradictions. He speaks of sleepless nights under relentless bombardments, of comrades screaming in agony, and of the eerie silence after battles where the dead outnumbered the living. Yet, as he shares his tale, a larger question emerges. How much his story is truth, and how much is an attempt to absolve himself of responsibility? Did he merely survive in the madness of war, or did he play a more active role in the suffering? Alexander claims he never wanted to kill, that he only sought to shoot back when necessary. But war isn't a situation where you get to wait and react. On the front lines near Bakhmut, decisions often had to be made in an instant: shoot or be shot. He recounts his platoon abandoning their positions under heavy fire, leaving him behind, wounded and disoriented. In those moments of despair, did he feel betrayed by his comrades, by his country, or by the lies that led him there? Or did this sense of abandonment justify, in his mind, the compliance that got him to that point? These moments expose the chasm between his personal motivations and the reality of his actions. Perhaps the most haunting part of Alexander's story is his attempt to reconcile his role in the war with the love he professes for his family. He says he joined the military to clear his criminal record and reconnect with his estranged daughter. but the path he chose ultimately led to destruction rather than redemption. How does a man who claims to seek a clean slate reconcile his presence in a foreign country, weapon in hand, advancing an unjust cause? Was his personal quest for absolution merely a delusion that blinded him to the harm he inflicted? Then there's the question of moral agency. He describes horrific scenes: a man whose body was torn apart by mortar fire while calling his mother, the haunting sight of comrades being slaughtered during retreats, and even his own injury from a grenade that shattered his hopes of escape. He tells these stories as though they were simply things that happened to him. But how did he contribute to the chaos? What roles did he play in perpetuating violence? And what memories is he choosing to leave out? His story, and the truth it reveals about the war, isn't just about Alexander. It's about the thousands like him. Men recruited from prisons, coerced or manipulated into becoming instruments of destruction. Their lives, shaped by systemic failures, intersect with the lives they destroy in a war far removed from their homes. They fought not for ideology, but for survival, redemption, or a promise of freedom that may never come. As Alexander's narrative unfolds, we're left to grapple with the larger truth. Is the war an amalgamation of personal tragedies like his, or is it a calculated machine that thrives on the destruction of the very people it enlists? What really drives someone like Alexander? Was it a desire to escape his past, or a willingness to trade his humanity for a fleeting promise of freedom? And how many more stories like his exist, hidden in the shadows of a war that continues to devastate both its victims and its participants? These are the questions his story compels us to ask, and the answers may reveal uncomfortable truths about both the war and the human cost of submission to an unjust cause. Alexander Bychkov was born in 1975 in the small village of Fedorovka, nestled deep in the Rostov region of Russia. Life there was defined by isolation and scarcity, with few opportunities to escape the grind of rural existence. His family, though modest and hardworking, struggled to make ends meet, and this instability became a defining feature of Alexander's early life. From a young age, he learned that survival often depended on self-reliance, resourcefulness, and, sometimes, bending the rules. As a teenager, Alexander's life began to take a darker turn. The small thrills of petty theft offered an escape from the monotony and a chance to fit in with local troublemakers. What started as stealing food or trinkets from market stalls quickly escalated into more serious crimes. By the time he reached his early 20s, he had become well acquainted with the criminal justice system, earning his first prison sentence for burglary. The experience was transformative, though not in the rehabilitative sense. Instead, it hardened him. Russian prisons were harsh and unforgiving, filled with unspoken codes of loyalty and power. Trust was fleeting, alliances were transactional, and displays of strength were often the difference between survival and becoming a target. Alexander adapted quickly, learning to navigate this brutal environment. Each sentence he served only reinforced the survival instincts he relied on. Prison became not just a place of punishment, but a community of its own, a grim brotherhood of those who had little to lose and even less to hope for. Upon release, Alexander returned to Fedorovka, but his home no longer felt like a sanctuary. The stigma of his criminal record followed him everywhere, and legitimate work was nearly impossible to secure. In a village with few prospects even for those without a tarnished reputation, his options were limited. Out of necessity, he turned to drug cultivation, growing cannabis in hidden patches of land outside the village. For Alexander, this wasn't about ambition or greed. It was survival. The income from the plants allowed him to maintain a semblance of control over his life, a way to exist on his own terms in a system that offered him no other path. However, his independence was short-lived. In 2020, a nationwide crackdown on drug operations reached the Rostov region. Police discovered 23 cannabis plants on Alexander's property, and he was swiftly arrested and sentenced to 4 years in prison. For many, this would have been a devastating blow, but for Alexander, it was a return to the only life he had known. By this point, prison was as familiar to him as the village he'd left behind. The rules of survival were the same. Power was temporary, loyalty was conditional, and vulnerability was a liability. During this sentence, Alexander often reflected on the family he had left behind. He hadn't spoken to his daughter in years, and the birth of his granddaughter, whom he had never met, weighed heavily on him. It became his one glimmer of hope, a reason to believe he could turn his life around. He imagined meeting her, telling her stories of the man he wanted to become rather than the man he had been. Yet, even this dream felt distant and unattainable, overshadowed by the cold reality of his situation. In late 2022, as the war in Ukraine escalated, Alexander's life took an unexpected turn. Russia's military, desperate for manpower, began recruiting from the country's prisons. When recruiters arrived at Alexander's camp, they came with a simple but seductive offer: fight for 6 months on the front lines and walk free with a clean slate. For many prisoners, the deal was as much a demand as an opportunity, but for Alexander, it was a potential lifeline. The promise of freedom and a chance to reunite with his family was too powerful to ignore. Yet, the decision was far from easy. Years of incarceration had made Alexander deeply cynical about authority and promises from those in power. He understood the risks of war, and he had no illusions about the nature of the conflict he was being asked to join. Still, the offer was impossible to refuse. It was a calculated move, a way to escape the cycle of imprisonment that had defined his life for decades. For Alexander, joining the war wasn't about patriotism or belief in the cause. It was a survival tactic. It was the next chapter in a life that had always been about making the best of impossible choices. Alexander Bychkov's relationship with his family was, in many ways, the greatest casualty of the life he chose, or perhaps the life that chose him. Years of incarceration, his tangled history with crime, and his inability to break free from the cycles of poverty and survivalism created a chasm between him and his only daughter. She was just a child when Alexander first went to prison, and by the time he returned, the damage had already been done. The bond they once shared had withered, leaving behind bitterness and distance that neither seemed able to bridge. For years, Alexander carried the weight of his failures as a father. His daughter had grown up without him, raised instead by her mother and extended family. Though he tried to reconnect after each release, the wounds ran too deep. She resented him for his absence, for the shame his criminal record brought to their family, and for his inability to offer her the stability she so desperately needed. Alexander, in turn, buried his regret beneath a hardened exterior, convincing himself that it was easier to leave her alone than to face the pain of rejection. But everything changed with the birth of his granddaughter. Alexander first learned of her existence during one of his stints in prison, and the news stirred something in him that he hadn't felt in years. A flicker of hope. He began to dream of redemption, of proving to his daughter and granddaughter that he could be a different man. The idea of being a grandfather offered him a second chance at the family life he had squandered. He imagined holding the child, telling her stories, and building a bond that might, in some small way, mend the fractures of his past. This hope became his lifeline during his final years in prison. He told himself that if he could just find a way to wipe the slate clean, to leave behind the mistakes of his past, he could finally offer his family the version of himself he had always wanted to be. It wasn't just about freedom, it was about redemption. Yet, as the months dragged on, the path to that redemption seemed increasingly out of reach. Alexander had no money, no job prospects, and no real plan for what to do once he was released. The dream of a new beginning remained just that, a dream. When the recruiters came to his prison with their offer, Alexander saw it as a lifeline. The deal was straightforward: 6 months on the front lines in Ukraine in exchange for freedom and a clean record. For a man like Alexander, it was a chance to start over, to finally be free of the system that had held him captive for so long. But it was also a gamble. The risks were enormous, and the morality of fighting in a war he didn't believe in weighed heavily on him. Yet, the thought of seeing his granddaughter, of holding her for the first time, outweighed the doubts and fears that plagued him. But still, his decision came at a cost. By signing the contract, Alexander traded one form of captivity for another. The promise of freedom was enticing, but the path to achieving it was paved with violence, destruction, and complicity in a war he knew was unjust. His dream of redemption clashed sharply with the reality of his actions. Could he truly call himself a better man when his freedom came at the expense of others' lives? Could he ever reconcile the image of the man he wanted to be with the choices he made to get there? In his heart, Alexander believed he was doing what he had to do for his family, for his future. But as he prepared for war, he couldn't escape the nagging doubt that perhaps this choice, like so many others before it, would lead not to redemption but to further ruin. The man who dreamed of holding his granddaughter for the first time was now a soldier heading into a conflict he barely understood, his hopes for a clean slate tangled in the bloody business of war. Alexander Bychkov's decision to join the war was not made lightly, nor was it entirely his own. It came at a moment when his hope for freedom was at its lowest, and the offer presented to him seemed like the only way out of an otherwise endless cycle of imprisonment. For Alexander, The promise of a new start was almost too good to be true, but it came with a price that would weigh on him long after the ink dried on his contract. It started with whispers in the prison yard, rumors that military recruiters were coming to offer inmates a deal. 6 months of service in Ukraine in exchange for amnesty. At first, Alexander dismissed it as just another tactic to intimidate or manipulate prisoners. But when the recruiters arrived in person, flanked by armed guards and carrying documents ready to be signed, the rumors became reality. They didn't need to use overt threats. Their presence alone sent a clear message: you join or you stay. The pitch was simple and seductive. Freedom, they said, could be his if he gave just 6 months of his life to serve the motherland. They framed the war as a noble cause, a defense of Russian sovereignty against supposed aggressors. But the promises of honor and patriotism meant little to Alexander, who had no illusions about the morality of the conflict. What appealed to him were the more personal incentives: a clean criminal record, early release, and the chance to rebuild his life on his terms. For a man who had spent so much of his life behind bars, the prospect of walking free was impossible to ignore. Yet, the decision wasn't entirely voluntary. The recruiters employed a mix of coercion and manipulation, using the prisoners' vulnerabilities against them. They hinted at what would happen to those who refused the offer: longer sentences, harsher treatment, or being sent to labor camps far from their families. Some prisoners who showed resistance were made examples of, their refusals met with sudden transfers to brutal facilities. For Alexander, who had endured years of incarceration and learned to read between the lines of authority, the choice felt less like an opportunity and more like a mandate. The recruiters also played on emotions, appealing to the prisoner's personal aspirations and struggles. They reminded Alexander of what was waiting for him outside: his daughter, his granddaughter, and the chance to finally live a life free from the shadow of his criminal past. They spoke of how soldiers were heroes, how their families would be proud, and how they would be rewarded for their sacrifices. The promises were wrapped in language that made Alexander feel as if this was not just a choice for survival, but a step toward redemption. Still, Alexander hesitated. He had spent much of his life calculating risks and making hard decisions, and he knew the war was a gamble he might not survive. The stories coming back from the front lines were grim. Heavy casualties, brutal conditions, and little regard for the lives of conscripts like him. He wrestled with the reality that he was trading one form of captivity for another, possibly worse, and that the freedom they offered might only come after he paid an unspeakable cost. Ultimately, it was the lack of alternatives that pushed Alexander to sign. He couldn't see a path forward as a prisoner, and he feared that refusing the offer would seal his fate as someone permanently trapped in the system. The promises of freedom, redemption, and reunion with his family outweighed his doubts, though they didn't erase them. He signed the papers with a reluctant hand, fully aware that he was stepping into a war he didn't understand, fighting for a cause he didn't believe in, under a flag that had never truly represented him. Alexander's decision to join wasn't about loyalty or patriotism. It was about survival. It was about grasping at the faintest glimmer of hope in a system designed to extinguish it. But as he prepared to leave the prison gates and enter a new kind of battlefield, he couldn't shake the fear that his decision might cost him more than his freedom was worth. Alexander Bychkov's first days in Ukraine were nothing like he had imagined. After months of incarceration and the controlled, harsh monotony of prison life, the battlefield was an entirely different chaos. The moment he arrived near the front lines, the sounds of war hit him like a wall. Constant shelling, the dull roar of tanks, and the sharp cracks of gunfire echoing across the distance. The air smelled of oil, damp earth, and fear. It was nothing like the recruiters had described, and Alexander was unprepared for the grim reality awaiting him. The journey to Ukraine itself had been jarring, packed into military transports alongside other prisoners turned conscripts. Alexander felt the uneasy silence of men who knew they were being thrown into a grinder. There were no rousing speeches, no camaraderie, just the cold efficiency of men herded toward a conflict none of them understood. The recruiters who had promised him redemption and freedom were nowhere to be seen. In their place were stern-faced officers barking orders and warning them that failure to obey would be met with swift punishment. Upon arrival, Alexander was thrust into a makeshift camp just a few kilometers from the active combat zone. There was no time to acclimate or prepare. He was handed a weapon, a battered rifle that seemed older than him, and minimal gear, just enough to survive for a few days. The officers didn't bother with formal training. "You'll learn on the job," they said, with a grimness that chilled him. As night fell on his first day, Alexander lay in a damp trench, clutching his rifle and listening to the distant explosions. Sleep was impossible. The fear of what the next day would bring gnawed at him. His first real taste of combat came unexpectedly. During a routine patrol, his unit was ambushed by Ukrainian forces. The sheer chaos of the attack overwhelmed him. The sharp whistle of incoming mortar rounds, the frantic shouts of his comrades, the blinding flashes of explosions tearing through the landscape. Alexander froze as bullets whizzed past, unable to make sense of what was happening. His hands trembled on his rifle, and for a moment, he thought he might not survive. The violence was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The brutality of it, the screams of the wounded, the sight of a comrade crumpling lifelessly just a few feet away, shattered any illusions he might have had about the nature of war. This wasn't a noble battle or a struggle for freedom. It was a slaughter, and he was a pawn in its machinery. He realized in those first harrowing moments how little the recruiters' promises meant. They hadn't prepared him for this. They had only sold him a lie. In the days that followed, Alexander tried to make sense of it all. He attempted to rationalize his place in the conflict, telling himself that he was just trying to survive, that he had no choice. He wasn't here out of loyalty to Russia or belief in its cause. He wasn't even here to fight an enemy. He was here because the system had left him with no alternatives. But even this reasoning couldn't silence the nagging voice in the back of his mind that questioned his complicity. Was survival enough of an excuse for the horrors he witnessed? Could he live with himself knowing he was part of the destruction? Alexander's shock didn't fade? It became a constant companion. Every day brought new horrors, from watching civilians flee their homes to seeing comrades die senselessly in attacks that gained nothing. He was haunted by the knowledge that he was fighting in a country that was not his, for a cause he did not believe in, against people who seemed more human to him than the officers barking orders. The first days in Ukraine stripped Alexander of any illusions he may have carried with him. They exposed the stark reality of his situation. He was a soldier in an unjust war, fighting battles he didn't understand, for promises that now felt as hollow as the craters left behind by the shells falling around him. It was a bitter truth, and one he struggled to reconcile with every passing day. Alexander's time near Bakhmut was a descent into a hell he could scarcely have imagined. The battle-scarred landscape seemed otherworldly, trees reduced to blackened stumps, fields turned into cratered wastelands, and villages stripped of life and color. It was a grim theater of destruction, with Alexander caught in the middle, grappling with the realities of war and the role he played in its perpetuation. One of his first encounters with death came during a failed offensive on the outskirts of Bakhmut. His unit had been ordered to advance under the cover of night, moving across open ground toward fortified Ukrainian positions. They were assured that artillery would clear the way, but the moment they stepped out, it was clear the plan had failed. The sky lit up with incoming fire, and Alexander watched in horror as men around him were cut down. One soldier, a young recruit barely out of his teens, was hit by shrapnel and collapsed screaming. Alexander froze, torn between helping and self-preservation. In the end, he kept moving, his survival instincts taking over. As the offensive crumbled, Alexander experienced the disarray of retreat. Soldiers ran in every direction, abandoning weapons and supplies as Ukrainian forces closed in. The chaos was overwhelming, with no clear orders or leadership. He described how men fell to their knees, weeping and praying for the shelling to stop. One soldier, in a moment of desperation, tried to desert, only to be caught by their commander and summarily executed, a warning to others. The sight of his comrade's body lying in the mud drove home the brutal reality. In this war, there was no room for hesitation or defiance. Alexander's reluctance to fire his weapon became a recurring theme in his accounts. He claimed he didn't want to kill, that he only raised his rifle when absolutely necessary, but the war wasn't forgiving to those who hesitated. During one skirmish, he was ordered to open fire on a group of retreating Ukrainian soldiers. His commanding officer barked at him to shoot, but Alexander faltered, his finger hovering over the trigger. The officer's fury was immediate, grabbing Alexander by the collar and shouting, "You shoot, or you'll be the next one they take down." Reluctantly, he fired, the bullets cutting through the night. He never knew if he hit anyone, but the memory stayed with him, gnawing at his conscience. Despite his claims of reluctance, Alexander couldn't deny his complicity in the violence. He might not have pulled the trigger often, but he was there, a cog in the machine, enabling the system that carried out the destruction. He helped secure supply routes, patrolled captured villages, and guarded checkpoints, all actions that indirectly supported the carnage around him. He witnessed soldiers looting homes, taking what little the villagers had left. When asked if he participated, Alexander denied it, but his silence in the face of such acts made him complicit. One of the most haunting moments he recounted was finding the body of a civilian woman near a destroyed building. She was clutching a bag of belongings, her lifeless eyes staring up at the sky. Alexander couldn't shake the image, nor the realization that she had been caught in the crossfire of a war she had no part in. He tried to convince himself that he wasn't to blame, that her death wasn't his responsibility. But deep down, he knew that by being there, by following orders, he was part of the machinery that had led to her demise. Alexander's encounters with violence weren't limited to the battlefield. One night, his unit was tasked with holding a checkpoint on a key supply route. A car approached in the darkness, its headlights off. The soldiers opened fire without warning, fearing an ambush. When they approached the wreckage, they found the bodies of a man and a boy, likely fleeing the conflict. Alexander described the moment as surreal, the weight of what had happened pressing down on him. He said he didn't fire that night, but he was there, rifle in hand, when the decision was made. The faces of the victims haunted him, and the sound of the boy's cries before the gunfire echoed in his dreams. The horrors he witnessed extended to his own comrades. During a defensive operation, his unit was shelled relentlessly for hours. He described the chaos, the deafening roar of explosions, the ground trembling beneath him, and the panicked cries of men trying to find cover. One soldier, whom Alexander had shared a meal with just hours earlier, was hit directly by a mortar. The blast tore him apart, leaving nothing but scattered remains. Alexander sat in stunned silence, his ears ringing, unable to process the loss. As the days turned into weeks, Alexander became increasingly numb. He described how the violence began to feel routine, how the constant barrage of death and suffering dulled his senses. Yet, in quiet moments, the weight of his actions and inactions would return. He wondered if his refusal to fully engage in the violence made him better than those around him, or if it simply made him a coward. He rationalized his reluctance as a small rebellion against the war, but he couldn't escape the truth. By being there, by following orders, he was complicit in the destruction. Near Bakhmut, Alexander learned that war was not just about the violence you commit. It was also about the violence you enable. His reluctance to shoot didn't absolve him of guilt. It only added to the moral ambiguity of his role. He had come to Ukraine with the hope of a clean slate, but each encounter with death and chaos only darkened the stain on his soul. The conflict around him wasn't just reshaping the land, it was reshaping him, forcing him to confront the unsettling reality of what he had become. Alexander Bychkov's account of his time in Ukraine paints a picture of a man caught between his own survival instincts and the escalating breakdown of morality around him. He described the war not just as a battle of armies, but as an unraveling of humanity itself. For Alexander, the war's impact was measured not only in casualties but in the collapse of the basic codes of conduct that separate soldiers from marauders. One of the most telling aspects of his story was the widespread looting that became commonplace among his comrades. Alexander claimed he never participated, insisting that his focus was solely on staying alive. But his descriptions of the events told a different story. He recounted watching soldiers raid abandoned homes, stuffing their packs with food, electronics, and even children's toys. Some of them, he said, would steal anything they could carry, even if it was useless. When pressed by the interviewer about his own involvement, Alexander hesitated before insisting, "I never took anything. I wasn't there for that." The interviewer, however, challenged his version of events, pointing out that Alexander's silence in those moments was itself a form of complicity. "Did you stop them?" the interviewer asked. Alexander admitted that he didn't. "It wasn't my place to get involved," he responded. But the interviewer pushed further, questioning whether his failure to intervene was truly about self-preservation or simply a way to avoid the moral burden of their actions. The critique exposed a recurring pattern in Alexander's narrative. His attempts to minimize his own culpability by framing himself as an observer rather than a participant. The mistreatment of civilians was another stark feature of the war Alexander described. He told of villages where Russian soldiers moved in like invaders, stripping locals of their remaining possessions and demanding information under the threat of violence. "We were ordered to question them," he explained, but it wasn't really about finding anything. It was about control. Alexander claimed he tried to stay out of these encounters, focusing instead on his assigned duties, but his accounts hinted at a deeper involvement. He described one instance where an elderly man, accused of hiding food supplies, was dragged from his home and beaten in front of his family. "I didn't touch him," Alexander insisted, "but I couldn't stop it either." The interviewer zeroed in on these moments, questioning how Alexander reconciled his passive role with the larger atrocities occurring around him. "You might not have hit him," the interviewer said, "but you stood there, armed, while it happened. Do you think that made the family feel any safer?" Alexander avoided answering directly, instead repeating that he had no choice. But the interviewer's pointed questions left his moral reasoning in shreds, exposing the contradictions between his actions and his attempts to absolve himself. In another story, Alexander described a day when his unit entered a small village that had been shelled the night before. The survivors, mostly women and children, huddled in a makeshift shelter. Alexander claimed he felt pity for them, but when asked what he did to help, his answer was evasive. "There wasn't anything I could do," he said. Yet his presence in that village, armed, part of an occupying force, was itself an act of oppression. The interviewer pressed him further. "Did you tell anyone to stop looting? Did you try to get food to the children?" Alexander shook his head, muttering, "It wasn't my responsibility." This theme of shifting blame became a hallmark of Alexander's story. He repeatedly framed himself as a powerless figure, swept along by circumstances beyond his control. But the interviewer's critiques painted a different picture, one of a man who chose passivity over resistance, complicity over confrontation. Each time Alexander insisted he wasn't to blame, the interviewer countered with examples of how his presence enabled the very actions he claimed to condemn. Alexander's narrative also revealed moments of self-awareness, though fleeting. He admitted that he sometimes wondered whether he could have done more to push back against the chaos. "I thought about speaking up," he said at one point, "but what difference would it have made? I was just trying to survive." These glimpses of reflection showed that Alexander wasn't entirely blind to the moral implications of his role. Yet, they also underscored his unwillingness to accept responsibility for the larger consequences of his inaction. For the interviewer, these contradictions were key to understanding Alexander's true character. While he portrayed himself as a victim of circumstance, his own words betrayed him. His attempts to minimize his culpability only highlighted the moral compromises he had made, whether consciously or not. By standing silent as his comrades looted and abused civilians, Alexander became a part of the very system of violence he claimed to detest. His story was not one of innocence lost, but of moral erosion. A slow, steady breakdown that left him grappling with the weight of his choices, or lack thereof. The war near Bakhmut wasn't just a battlefield for Alexander. It was a crucible that tested and ultimately broke the limits of his moral boundaries. While he might have avoided direct acts of violence, his presence and silence perpetuated the horrors around him. The interviewer's relentless questioning revealed the deeper truth. Alexander's complicity lay not in what he did, but in what he allowed to happen. And in war, as the interviewer pointed out, sometimes that's the greatest crime of all. Alexander Bychkov's capture marked the bitter culmination of a mission doomed from the start. His unit had been ordered to hold a crumbling position near Bakhmut as Ukrainian forces advanced with unrelenting precision. Supplies were running low, morale was shattered, and the promises of reinforcements were as empty as the ration boxes scattered across their camp. As the enemy closed in, it became clear to Alexander that survival would require disobedience. The decision to flee came in the dead of night. Under the cover of darkness, Alexander and a small group of comrades made their way out of their position, abandoning their orders in favor of self-preservation. It wasn't cowardice, Alexander would later insist. It was survival. We were left with no other choice. Yet, as they moved through the thick forests surrounding the battlefield, it became evident that escape was just as perilous as staying put. The air was heavy with the distant rumble of artillery, and every rustling leaf felt like a harbinger of death. Their escape attempt quickly unraveled. A Ukrainian reconnaissance drone, nearly silent against the night, spotted their movement. Within minutes, mortars rained down on their path, scattering the group. Alexander ran blindly through the darkness, the explosions tearing through the trees around him. A sharp, searing pain in his leg brought him to the ground. A piece of shrapnel had embedded itself just above his knee. Panic set in as he realized he couldn't move, the weight of his injuries pinning him to the forest floor. Alexander called out for his comrades, but the only response was the echo of his own voice. They had fled, leaving him behind. "I kept shouting," he later recounted, but no one came back. They were gone. It was in that moment that the full weight of his abandonment hit him. The camaraderie he had clung to, the idea that they were all in this together, dissolved in the cold reality of war. For Alexander, it wasn't just his comrades who had left him. It was the system he had fought for. the promises of redemption and freedom that had led him to this place. Bleeding and alone, Alexander dragged himself into a shallow ditch for cover. The night felt endless as he lay there, clutching his leg and listening to the distant sounds of battle. He tried to stay silent, fearing that any noise would alert the advancing Ukrainian troops to his presence. But as the hours passed and the pain grew unbearable, he realized that he couldn't stay hidden forever. He was losing blood, his vision blurred by exhaustion and shock. By dawn, Ukrainian forces were sweeping the area, and Alexander's position was discovered. The soldiers approached cautiously, their weapons trained on him as he raised his hands in surrender. "I didn't resist," he said. What would have been the point? I couldn't even stand. The capture itself was swift and impersonal, a stark contrast to the chaos that had preceded it. The Ukrainian soldiers disarmed him, searched his belongings, and carried him to their makeshift camp for interrogation. In those initial moments of captivity, Alexander's emotions swung between fear and relief. He feared what his captors might do to him, but there was also a strange comfort in knowing that the struggle to survive, at least for the moment, was over. The interrogators weren't cruel, but their questions were pointed. "Why are you here?" they asked. "What did you think you were fighting for?" Alexander's answers were halting and evasive, a mix of self-preservation and genuine confusion. He spoke of coercion, of promises made and broken, of a system that had given him no other choice. Yet, even as he tried to explain himself, he knew his words rang hollow. The key realization for Alexander wasn't just that his comrades had abandoned him. It was that the entire structure he had fought for had left him to rot. The system that had promised him freedom had used him up and discarded him like so many others. As he sat in the makeshift camp, his leg bandaged but throbbing with pain, he reflected on the choices that had led him there. He had joined the war to escape one form of captivity, only to find himself in another. And now, as a prisoner of the very people he had been sent to fight, he was left to confront the bitter truth. He had been nothing more than a pawn in a game he barely understood. Alexander's capture was not just the end of his role in the war. It was the moment he realized how thoroughly he had been betrayed. By his comrades, by his commanders, and by the promises of a system that had convinced him to trade his humanity for a fleeting hope of freedom. In the cold light of morning, as his captors questioned him and the sounds of war raged on in the distance, Alexander knew that whatever came next, the man he had been when he entered this war no longer existed. Alexander Bychkov's attempts to defend his actions during the war were as tangled as the war itself. He framed himself as a man with no choice, a victim of circumstances beyond his control. Over hours of questioning, he repeatedly emphasized his lack of agency, his reluctance to fight, and the belief that he was merely a pawn caught in the tide of a war he neither understood nor supported. Yet, as the interviewer probed deeper, these justifications began to crumble, exposing contradictions in a far more complex and culpable reality. "I didn't want to be there," Alexander said early in the interview, his voice steady but defensive. "They gave us no choice. Either you fight or you rot in prison." He described the deal he was offered as coercive, insisting that the promise of freedom left him with no realistic alternatives. But the interviewer pressed him on this point, asking why he agreed to such terms without questioning the morality of fighting in a war he admitted knowing little about. "You knew where you were going," the interviewer said. "You knew what this war was doing to civilians. Didn't that make you stop and think?" Alexander's response was evasive. "I thought about it," he admitted, "but what could I have done? They don't ask you for your opinion. You do what you're told." This became a recurring theme in his defense, the idea that his actions were dictated by forces beyond his control. He claimed to be a victim of manipulation, a man thrust into a conflict against his will. Yet, the interviewer noted how often Alexander described moments where he made choices that, whether out of fear, apathy, or convenience, aligned him with the very system he claimed to oppose. One of the starkest contradictions came when Alexander spoke about his reluctance to fire his weapon. "I didn't kill anyone," he insisted. "I only shot when I had no other option." But the interviewer pointed out that his presence on the battlefield, armed and following orders, made him an active participant in the violence. "You might not have pulled the trigger every time," the interviewer said, "but you were there. You helped secure villages that were looted. You stood by as civilians were mistreated. How do you reconcile that with your claim of innocence?" Alexander struggled to answer. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, repeating that he had no choice and that his focus was always on survival. "If I had spoken out, they'd have shot me," he said. But the interviewer pressed him further, asking why he didn't at least try to distance himself from the more egregious actions of his comrades. "You could have said no," the interviewer argued. "You could have refused to participate in the looting or stood up for the civilians. Instead, you stayed silent." In response, Alexander leaned heavily on the idea of fear. He described the consequences of disobedience: beatings, mock executions, and in some cases, outright killings of those who refused orders. He recounted how a fellow soldier who tried to desert was executed by their commander in front of the entire unit. "After seeing that, how could I take a stand?" he asked. "What good would it have done?" But the interviewer wasn't convinced. "Fear explains your silence," they said. "But it doesn't excuse it. You weren't just silent. You followed orders even when you knew those orders were wrong. You might not have looted, but you guarded the checkpoints that allowed it to happen. You might not have hit civilians, but you stood by while others did. Doesn't that make you part of the system you claim to hate?" Alexander attempted to shift the conversation, emphasizing his belief that he was as much a victim of the war as the people he had been sent to fight. He spoke about his injuries, his abandonment by his comrades, and his eventual capture as proof that he had suffered too. "Do you think I wanted this?" he asked, his voice rising with frustration. "I'm sitting here as a prisoner. I've lost everything. My freedom, my dignity, my family. Isn't that punishment enough?" But the interviewer refused to let him off the hook, pointing out that his suffering didn't erase the suffering he had contributed to. "You say you've lost everything," they said. "But what about the people whose homes were destroyed because your unit moved through their village? What about the families who lost loved ones during your patrols? Can you really claim the moral high ground when you were part of the machine that caused their suffering?" Faced with these questions, Alexander's defense began to falter. His arguments, once confident and deflective, gave way to moments of hesitation and contradiction. He admitted that he often felt guilty about what he had seen and done, but he clung to the idea that he had no other choice. "What was I supposed to do?" he asked again, his voice quieter now. "If I refused, I'd be dead. If I spoke out, no one would listen. I just wanted to survive." The interviewer's critique was sharp and unrelenting. Survival, they argued, didn't absolve Alexander of his responsibility. "You might not have been the one giving orders," they said, "but you followed them. You might not have wanted to be there, but you stayed. And by staying, you helped make all of this possible. That's something you'll have to live with." Alexander's attempts to claim innocence and lack of agency ultimately collapsed under the weight of his own contradictions. His justifications painted a picture of a man struggling to reconcile his actions with his conscience, but they also revealed the ease with which he had aligned himself with a system of violence and oppression. By the end of the interrogation, Alexander's story was no longer one of a victim caught in the tide of war. It was the story of a man who chose survival over morality, and who now faced the inescapable consequences of that choice. Alexander Bychkov's narrative began to falter when the weight of responsibility could no longer be avoided. For all his attempts to paint himself as a powerless participant in a larger system, there were moments in his account that revealed a deeper awareness of the war's brutality and his role within it. These moments, where his defenses crumbled and the contradictions of his actions became undeniable, exposed the truth he had been trying to evade. He was not simply a victim of the war. He was a participant. One such moment came when Alexander described the aftermath of a nighttime shelling in a small village his unit had been ordered to secure. The attack had been indiscriminate, reducing homes to rubble and leaving civilians trapped beneath the debris. Alexander recalled walking through the ruins at dawn, the air thick with dust and smoke, and coming across the body of a young boy. "He couldn't have been more than 5 or 6, Alexander said, his voice quiet. He was lying there, clutching a stuffed animal. It looked like he'd been trying to run. The image haunted him, but when asked what he did in that moment, his answer was chilling in its simplicity. I kept walking." The interviewer seized on this moment, asking why he hadn't stopped to help, why he hadn't even tried to dig through the rubble for survivors. Alexander's response was evasive. "There was nothing I could do," he said. "We were told to keep moving, to secure the area. It wasn't my job to stop and look for survivors." But the interviewer pressed further, pointing out that his decision to follow orders, even in the face of such horror, made him complicit in the violence. "You saw the consequences of your unit's actions firsthand," the interviewer said. "Didn't that make you question what you were doing there?" Alexander hesitated, his usual justifications faltering. "I did question it," he admitted. "But what could I have done? If I had disobeyed, they would have punished me. They don't tolerate hesitation." Yet even as he spoke, it was clear that he understood the hollowness of his defense. He had seen the atrocities, felt the weight of their consequences, and chosen to stay silent. not out of ignorance, but out of fear. Another key moment came when Alexander recounted an incident involving a civilian woman accused of aiding Ukrainian forces. She had been dragged to the center of her village and interrogated by Alexander's commanding officer. When she refused to answer their questions, the officer ordered her to be beaten as an example. Alexander stood nearby, watching as the soldiers carried out the punishment. "I didn't touch her," he said. "I didn't want any part of it." But when the interviewer asked why he didn't intervene, his response was telling. "It wasn't my place to get involved." The interviewer didn't let the matter rest. "You were there," they said, "armed in uniform, standing with the men who hurt her. Do you think she saw you as innocent? Do you think her family saw you as just an observer?" Alexander had no answer. His silence, both in the interview and during the incident itself, spoke volumes. It was a stark reminder that in war, inaction can be as damning as action. Perhaps the most revealing moment of the interview came when Alexander was asked about his awareness of the war's broader implications. By this point, he had admitted that he didn't believe in the cause he was fighting for, that he saw the war as unjust and destructive. But when asked why he continued to follow orders, his response was a mix of resignation and self-preservation. "What choice did I have?" he said. "If I had refused, they would have killed me. If I had run, I wouldn't have gotten far. So I stayed. I survived." The interviewer countered by asking whether survival alone justified his actions. "You talk about survival as though it excuses everything," they said. "But you didn't just survive, you helped perpetuate the war. You followed orders, even when you knew they were wrong. You enabled a system that caused unimaginable suffering. Do you really believe that's enough of an excuse?" Alexander looked down, his hands fidgeting in his lap. For the first time, he didn't try to argue. As the interview continued, Alexander began to acknowledge the moral weight of his decisions, though reluctantly. He admitted that he often thought about the people he had seen suffering, the civilians displaced from their homes, the comrades who died in pointless battles, the children buried under rubble. "I think about them every night," he said. "I tell myself it wasn't my fault, but deep down, I know I was part of it." The interviewer pushed him further, asking whether he believed he deserved forgiveness. Alexander's response was heavy with uncertainty. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe not. Maybe what I've done can't be forgiven. But what else was I supposed to do? I didn't ask to be there. I didn't want to hurt anyone." Yet even as he spoke, the weight of his guilt was palpable. His words might have been meant to absolve himself, but they revealed a man struggling to reconcile his actions with his conscience. By the end of the interview, Alexander's narrative had unraveled. His attempts to claim innocence and lack of agency had given way to moments of reflection and guilt, exposing the truth he could no longer deny. He had been more than a victim of the war. He had been a participant, a cog in a machine that thrived on destruction and suffering. And while he might not have pulled every trigger or given every order, his presence and compliance made him complicit. The weight of that responsibility, heavy and unyielding, was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Russian propaganda played a crucial role in shaping Alexander Bychkov's worldview and guiding his decisions, as it did for thousands like him. For years, the state-run media had carefully constructed a narrative that blurred the lines between truth and fabrication, feeding the population a steady diet of fear, nationalism, and misinformation. For Alexander, already living on the margins of society, this manipulation wasn't immediately obvious, but its impact was profound. Before his conscription, Alexander's exposure to propaganda came primarily through state television, the only reliable source of information in his rural village. News programs consistently painted a picture of Russia as a besieged nation, surrounded by enemies determined to strip it of its sovereignty and humiliate its people. Ukraine, they claimed, was not an independent country but a puppet of NATO, acting as a staging ground for Western aggression. For someone like Alexander, who had limited access to alternative perspectives, these stories became his reality. Alexander described how the messaging tapped into deep-seated fears and resentments, often invoking Russia's historical struggles against foreign invaders. "They made it sound like the world was against us," he said, "like we had no choice but to defend ourselves." This framing gave the war an air of inevitability, an act of survival rather than aggression. It played on national pride, convincing citizens that to question the war was to betray their country. Even those like Alexander, who lacked enthusiasm for the conflict, found it difficult to challenge such deeply ingrained narratives. The propaganda was particularly effective in portraying Ukrainians as both aggressors and victims of Western manipulation. Alexander recalled watching programs that depicted Ukrainian soldiers as brutal nationalists intent on oppressing ethnic Russians, juxtaposed with images of ordinary Ukrainians suffering under corrupt leadership. They showed us the same thing over and over, he said. Ukrainians being controlled by NATO, their soldiers committing atrocities. After a while, you start to believe it, even if it doesn't feel right. For prisoners like Alexander, the manipulation didn't stop with television. Recruiters who came to the prisons used the same propaganda techniques, but with an added layer of coercion. They framed the war as a chance for redemption, a way for Alexander to prove his loyalty to Russia and earn his freedom. They described the Ukrainian enemy as barbaric, dehumanizing them to make the idea of fighting more palatable. They said we'd be liberators. Alexander recounted that the people there would thank us for saving them. Yet, when Alexander arrived in Ukraine, the stark contrast between the propaganda and reality began to unravel the carefully constructed lies. He saw villages devastated not by Ukrainian forces but by Russian shelling. He met civilians who weren't hostile nationalists but terrified families caught in the crossfire. These contradictions gnawed at him, forcing him to question everything he had been told. I started to realize that nothing they said was true, he admitted. The people didn't want us there. We weren't liberators. We were invaders. Despite this realization, the power of propaganda was difficult to shake. Alexander admitted that part of him still clung to the narrative he had grown up with, even as he witnessed the destruction firsthand. You spend your whole life hearing one thing, he said. It's hard to just let it go. The propaganda had done more than manipulate his understanding of the war. It had shaped his identity, tying his sense of self-worth to a distorted image of Russian strength and resilience. The interviewer pointed out how the propaganda wasn't just about convincing Alexander to fight. It was about stripping him of the ability to see alternative choices. By framing the war as an existential struggle, it left no room for dissent or questioning. They didn't just lie to you, the interviewer said. They made you feel like there was no other way. That's how propaganda works. It doesn't just tell you what to think. It makes you believe you thought it yourself. For thousands like Alexander, the impact of this manipulation was devastating. Propaganda didn't just create soldiers. It created a system where those soldiers believed their actions were justified, even when they weren't. It blurred the lines between patriotism and coercion, leaving men like Alexander trapped in a cycle of obedience and complicity. And while he eventually saw through the lies, the damage had already been done. The propaganda that had brought him to Ukraine was the same force that ensured he stayed, even when the truth became impossible to ignore. In reflecting on the war, Alexander admitted that propaganda had stolen more than his understanding of the conflict. It had stolen his ability to trust, to question, and to see himself as anything other than a pawn in someone else's game. They used us, he said, and we let them. We didn't even realize it was happening. It was a sobering realization, one that underscored the true cost of the lies he had been fed. Not just the destruction of Ukraine, but the loss of his own sense of agency and humanity. Alexander Bychkov often spoke of the war with a detachment that seemed at odds with the horrors he described. He recounted events in clinical detail, as though the destruction and suffering were simply facts of his environment rather than consequences of actions he had played a part in. Yet, for the Ukrainian civilians who lived through the war, the devastation was far from abstract. It was deeply personal, and its effects would linger for generations. One of Alexander's stories described a village his unit had passed through shortly after an artillery bombardment. The houses were reduced to rubble, their walls scarred with shrapnel. A school building, its roof caved in, still had desks and chairs scattered among the debris. Alexander recalled seeing a group of villagers sorting through the wreckage, salvaging what little they could. They didn't even look at us, he said. They just kept digging. It was like they didn't care we were there. His words were matter of fact, as if the destruction he witnessed were inevitable, a natural consequence of war. The interviewer, however, challenged Alexander's detached perspective by drawing attention to the human cost of the scenes he described. You talk about the buildings, the interviewer said, but what about the people? Did you think about the lives that were destroyed along with them? The families who lost everything? Alexander shifted uncomfortably in his seat, admitting that he hadn't given it much thought at the time. I didn't know their stories, he said. I just saw the damage, but the interviewer didn't let him off so easily, pressing him to confront the reality behind the rubble. They described the lives of the people in that village, parents who had lost children in the shelling, elders who stayed behind to protect what little they had left, children who no longer had homes or schools. When you walked through that village, the interviewer said, you weren't just seeing destroyed buildings, you were walking through someone's life, shattered by war. Alexander's detachment extended to his accounts of civilian casualties. He spoke of bodies found in the streets as though they were merely objects to be moved aside. In one instance, he described coming across a man lying near a checkpoint, his belongings scattered around him. He was already dead when we got there, Alexander said. We didn't touch him. There was no point. The interviewer pressed him on this moment, asking whether he had considered who the man was, what his story might have been. I didn't know him, Alexander replied. He was just there. For the interviewer, this detachment was a stark contrast to the stories they had heard from Ukrainian survivors. They recounted a similar checkpoint scene, but from the perspective of a woman whose husband had been shot there while trying to flee with their children. She described the terror of hiding in a ditch as gunfire rang out, clutching her children to her chest and praying they wouldn't be next. Her husband's body was left in the road for hours, a reminder to others of the risks of defiance. That man you saw, the interviewer said, was someone's husband, someone's father. He wasn't just there. He was everything to someone. The cost of war wasn't limited to lives lost. It extended to the very fabric of Ukrainian communities. The interviewer described how infrastructure, meticulously built over decades, was wiped out in weeks. Roads became impassable craters. Hospitals were bombed out of operation. Power grids lay in ruins, leaving entire cities in darkness. Alexander acknowledged seeing this destruction but spoke of it in logistical terms. We had to avoid certain areas, he said. There were no bridges left to cross. For him, the devastation was an obstacle to navigate, not a tragedy to mourn. But for the Ukrainians who lived through it, the loss of infrastructure meant the loss of basic human needs. Heat in the winter, clean water to drink, a safe place to sleep. The interviewer shared stories of families forced to live in basements for months, of doctors performing surgeries by flashlight, of children scavenging through debris for firewood. When you saw those ruined roads and bridges, the interviewer asked, did you ever think about what that meant for the people who used them? For the farmers who couldn't get their crops to market? For the patients who couldn't reach a hospital? Alexander didn't have an answer, as the interviewer contrasted Alexander's detached accounts with the visceral realities of war. It became clear that his perspective had been shaped by necessity. To survive, Alexander had learned to distance himself from the suffering around him. If I let it get to me, he said, I wouldn't have been able to keep going. Yet this detachment came at a cost. It allowed him to excuse his role in the war, to see the destruction as inevitable rather than preventable. The interviewer didn't accept this rationale, arguing that his detachment was part of the problem. The war doesn't just happen, they said. It happens because people like you follow orders without questioning them. Because you look at rubble and see a pile of bricks instead of someone's home. Because you see a body and don't think about the life that was taken. These words seemed to hit Alexander harder than anything else. For the first time, he acknowledged that perhaps his detachment wasn't just a coping mechanism. It was a way to avoid taking responsibility. By the end of the discussion, the devastating impact of the war had become impossible for Alexander to ignore. The interviewer's stories of Ukrainian civilians had filled in the gaps of his narrative, forcing him to confront the human cost of the destruction he had witnessed. The cost of war wasn't just measured in shattered buildings or disrupted supply lines. It was measured in lives irreparably changed, communities torn apart, and a future stolen from an entire generation. And while Alexander may not have pulled the trigger or dropped the bombs, his presence had enabled the system that made it all possible. That, the interviewer argued, was a cost he couldn't escape. Alexander Bychkov often spoke of his family as both his greatest regret and his only hope. His choices, shaped by years of incarceration, the manipulation of propaganda, and the unforgiving calculus of survival, had created a chasm between him and the life he once imagined for himself. As he sat in captivity, reflecting on his role in an unjust war, he couldn't escape the question that haunted him most. Could he ever rebuild the relationships he had lost, or had the damage become irreparable? His relationship with his daughter had been strained for years, long before the war. She had grown up with an absent father, her childhood marked by his repeated incarcerations and inability to provide stability. By the time she became an adult, the bond they once shared was a distant memory, replaced by resentment and disappointment. Alexander knew this, even if he rarely spoke of it. She had every reason to hate me, he admitted. I wasn't there when she needed me. I left her with nothing. The birth of his granddaughter had given Alexander a renewed sense of purpose, a reason to believe he could redeem himself. In prison, He clung to the hope that one day he could meet the child, hold her, and be the grandfather he had failed to be as a father. This dream, however, came with its own weight of expectation. He wanted to show his family that he had changed, that he could be someone they could rely on. But his decision to join the war, made under the promise of freedom, had only deepened the gulf between them. When asked about his family's reaction to his enlistment, Alexander fell silent for a long moment. "I didn't tell them," he said finally. "I didn't want them to know where I was going or why. I thought maybe if I survived I could explain it to them later. But what could I say? That I joined a war I didn't believe in for a freedom I might never get." His voice wavered as he spoke, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. The interviewer challenged him, pointing out that his decision wasn't just about survival, it was about priorities. "You wanted freedom for yourself," they said, "but did you think about what your choices would mean for your family? How would your daughter feel, knowing her father became part of something that caused so much suffering?" Alexander struggled to respond, his usual defenses faltering. "I thought I was doing it for them," he said. "I thought, if I could come back with a clean record, maybe they'd give me another chance." But the interviewer pressed further, asking whether Alexander truly believed that freedom earned through war could bring reconciliation. "Your granddaughter won't remember the man who came back," they said. "She'll remember the choices you made to get there. How do you reconcile that with the legacy you want to leave behind?" Alexander's response was halting, filled with uncertainty. He admitted that he often wondered what his granddaughter would think of him if she ever learned the truth. "I wanted to be someone she could be proud of," he said. "But how can I, after everything I've done? After everything I've seen?" These questions, yet answered and perhaps unanswerable, revealed the depths of his internal conflict. He wanted redemption, but the path he had chosen seemed only to push it further out of reach. The interviewer contrasted Alexander's hopes with the stark reality faced by families in Ukraine, many of whom would never have the chance to reconcile with their loved ones. They described mothers who lost sons, children who became orphans, and communities left shattered by the war's violence. "What would you say to them?" the interviewer asked. "To the families who will never get their loved ones back because of this war? How do you think they'd feel about your desire for a second chance?" Alexander struggled with this question, his usual defenses giving way to a rare moment of self-awareness. "I don't know what I'd say to them," he admitted. "I don't think there's anything I could say. What we've done to them, it's unforgivable." His voice trailed off, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. For a moment, it seemed as though he was confronting the full extent of the harm his actions had caused, not just to his family, but to countless others. As the interview drew to a close, the focus returned to Alexander's hopes for reconciliation. He spoke of wanting to write to his daughter, to explain his choices and ask for forgiveness. But even as he said the words, it was clear he doubted whether such forgiveness was possible. "I don't expect them to welcome me back," he said, "but maybe they'll understand why I did what I did. Maybe they'll see that I didn't have a choice." The interviewer, however, challenged this framing, arguing that Alexander's choices, however limited, were still choices. "You want your family to forgive you," they said, "but have you forgiven yourself? Can you?" Alexander didn't answer. Instead, he stared at his hands, the silence speaking volumes about the unresolved guilt he carried. In the end, Alexander's story was one of shattered hopes and lingering questions. His choices had taken him far from the man he wanted to be, leaving behind a legacy stained by war and loss. Whether his family could ever reconcile with him remained uncertain, but perhaps the greater question was whether Alexander could reconcile with himself. In his quest for freedom, he had lost far more than he had gained, leaving his dreams of redemption buried beneath the wreckage of war. Life in captivity for Alexander Bychkov was a stark departure from the chaos of the battlefield, but it came with its own set of challenges. Each day began and ended in the confines of a small shared cell with routines dictated by his captors. The monotony of imprisonment was both a relief and a torment, a reprieve from the violence of war, yet a constant reminder of his circumstances and the choices that had led him there. Mornings began early, with the guards banging on the cell doors to wake the prisoners. Alexander and the others would line up for a head count before being escorted to a communal area for breakfast. The meals were simple, watery porridge or bread with weak tea, but Alexander ate without complaint. "You don't expect luxury in a place like this," he said. "You take what you get, and you're thankful you're alive." Work assignments followed breakfast, though they were more about keeping prisoners occupied than accomplishing anything meaningful. Alexander spent hours cleaning the grounds, organizing supplies, or performing minor maintenance tasks. The labor was grueling, but offered a rare opportunity to move around and interact with others. Even so, the conversations were limited, mostly exchanges of survival tips or stories from home. Few prisoners spoke of the war, as though silence could shield them from the memories. Evenings brought moments of relative quiet. Back in his cell, Alexander would sit on his cot and reflect on his choices. He admitted that the stillness often magnified his guilt, forcing him to confront the consequences of his actions. During the war, everything moves so fast, he said. You don't have time to think about what you're doing. But here, there's nothing but time. These moments of reflection were both a burden and a necessity. Alexander replayed the decisions he had made, the orders he had followed, and the lives that had been lost along the way. He spoke of a recurring image that haunted him, a young boy clutching a stuffed animal, lifeless on the ground. I see him every night, Alexander admitted. I can't stop thinking about who he was, what his life was like before we destroyed everything. The guilt weighed heavily on him, but Alexander also struggled with a sense of betrayal. He felt abandoned by the system that had coerced him into the war and by the comrades who had left him to die. They used us, he said bitterly. They promised us freedom, but it was just another lie. We were expendable, nothing more. The interviewer asked whether captivity had given him a new perspective on his role in the war. Alexander's response was measured, his tone reflecting a mix of regret and resignation. I've had a lot of time to think about it, he said. At first, I told myself it wasn't my fault, that I didn't have a choice. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that I did. I could have refused. I could have tried to escape earlier. I could have done something, anything, to stop it. These moments of clarity, however, were fleeting. Alexander often fell back on the idea that his survival instincts had left him with no alternatives. When you're in the middle of it, he said, you don't think about right or wrong. You just think about making it to the next day. Still, it was clear that his time in captivity had forced him to confront the moral ambiguity of his actions in a way he hadn't before. Interactions with the guards were another part of his daily life, and they often revealed the complexities of his situation. While some treated him with disdain, others showed surprising empathy. Not all of them are cruel, Alexander said. Some of them talk to us, ask us about our lives. It's strange, really. They're supposed to be our enemies, but sometimes they treat us better than our own commanders did. Despite these moments of humanity, captivity was a constant reminder of his status as a prisoner, not just of war, but of his choices and their consequences. Alexander spoke of writing letters to his daughter and granddaughter, though he wasn't sure if they would ever reach them. I don't even know if they want to hear from me, he said, but I have to try. It's the only thing that keeps me going. The routine of captivity gave Alexander time to reflect, but it also stripped him of any illusions he might have had about redemption. I don't think I'll ever make up for what I've done, he said, but maybe I can learn to live with it. These words, spoken softly and without conviction, underscored the depth of his internal struggle. Alexander's life in captivity was defined not by physical hardship, but by the emotional toll of confronting a past he couldn't change and a future that remained uncertain. As Alexander Bychkov sat in captivity, reflecting on his role in the war, the question of whether he truly understood the consequences of his actions loomed large. He spoke often of regret, of the choices he had made, the lives destroyed, and the trust betrayed. Yet, when pressed to articulate the lessons he had learned, his answers revealed a man still wrestling with the tension between self-preservation and accountability. When asked directly what he had learned from the experience, Alexander's initial response was defensive. I've learned that war is pointless, he said. It destroys everything. People, homes, lives. Nothing good comes from it. He spoke of the senselessness of the conflict, the lies that had brought him to the battlefield, and the betrayal he felt from a system that had used and discarded him. They told us we were fighting for something important, he said, but all we did was destroy, while his words conveyed bitterness toward the war itself. They skirted around the deeper question of his personal role in it. The interviewer pointed out this discrepancy, asking whether Alexander believed he bore any responsibility for the destruction he witnessed. I was just following orders, he replied. What else could I have done? If I had refused, I wouldn't be here right now. I'd be dead. This justification, rooted in survival, was a recurring theme in Alexander's narrative. He often framed his actions as unavoidable, the result of circumstances beyond his control. Yet, as the interviewer delved deeper, it became clear that this reasoning was as much a defense mechanism as it was an explanation. You talk about survival, the interviewer said, But survival doesn't erase the consequences of your actions. Do you understand the impact of what you were part of? Alexander hesitated, his usual confidence giving way to uncertainty. I think about it, he admitted. I think about the people who lost their homes, their families. I think about the boy I saw lying in the rubble. I can't get his face out of my head. I didn't want to be there. I didn't want to be part of it. But I was. His voice faltered, revealing a flicker of self-awareness. Yet, even as he acknowledged the pain he had witnessed, he struggled to fully embrace his role in causing it. The interviewer pressed further, challenging Alexander's tendency to distance himself from the atrocities he described. You say you didn't want to be there, they said, but you were. You followed orders. You guarded checkpoints where civilians were mistreated. You helped secure villages that were looted. Whether you wanted to or not, you were part of the system that caused this suffering. Have you really come to terms with that? Alexander's response was halting, filled with contradictions. I know I was part of it, he said. I know I can't undo what happened. But what could I have done differently? If I had refused, I wouldn't have survived. If I had spoken out, no one would have listened. His words, though laced with regret, betrayed a lingering belief that his choices had been inevitable. It was clear that while Alexander recognized the consequences of the war, he remained entrenched in the idea that he had no real agency. The interviewer, however, wasn't satisfied with this explanation. You talk about what you couldn't do, they said. But what about what you could have done? Could you have spoken to your commanders? Could you have tried to protect the civilians you saw suffering? Could you have made even a small choice to stand against what you knew was wrong? Alexander's silence in response to these questions was telling. For all his reflections, the idea of taking responsibility for his inaction seemed beyond his grasp. As the discussion continued, Alexander began to show glimpses of deeper understanding. He admitted that he often wondered how his life might have been different if he had made other choices. Maybe I could have refused to fight, he said. Maybe I could have tried to escape earlier. Maybe I could have done something. Yet, even these admissions were tinged with doubt, as though he couldn't fully imagine a version of himself capable of defying the system that had shaped him. The interviewer concluded with a pointed question. Do you think you've truly learned anything from this, or are you just looking for a way to justify what you did? Alexander didn't answer immediately. He stared at the floor, his hands fidgeting as he searched for a response. I don't know, he said finally. Maybe it's both. I know I can't change what I did, but I have to believe I can do better if I ever get the chance. Otherwise, what's the point of all this? In the end, Alexander's reflections revealed a man caught between regret and justification. While he acknowledged the suffering caused by the war and his part in it, he remained reluctant to fully embrace his responsibility. His lessons, though deeply felt, were incomplete, fragments of understanding overshadowed by a lifetime of survival instincts and moral ambiguity. Whether he would ever truly grasp the consequences of his actions remained an open question, one he would likely struggle with for the rest of his life. Alexander Bychkov's story is not just a tale of one man's journey through a war he didn't believe in. It is a reflection of the broader complexities of justice and accountability in times of conflict. His actions, shaped by coercion, fear, and survival, highlight the uncomfortable truth that war doesn't just destroy lives, it corrodes the moral fabric of everyone it touches. And while Alexander may have been a pawn in a larger system, his story raises questions that extend far beyond his own choices. At the heart of Alexander's narrative is the question of responsibility. Can a man who claims to have acted under duress be held accountable for his role in atrocities? Does his reluctance to shoot absolve him of guilt, or does his presence on the battlefield make him complicit? These are not easy questions to answer, but they are essential to ask. For justice to prevail, it must account for both the actions of individuals and the systems that enable them. Alexander's own reflections reveal the tension between personal accountability and systemic failure. He has come to recognize, however reluctantly, that his choices, though limited, contributed to the suffering of countless civilians. I didn't pull the trigger every time, he said, but I didn't stop it either. I let it happen. His words, stripped of their earlier defensiveness, underscore the need for a deeper reckoning, not just for himself, but for all who played a role in the war. The interviewer, drawing on the stories of Ukrainian civilians, emphasized the broader need for accountability, not as a means of retribution, but as a step toward reconciliation and healing. Justice isn't about punishment, they said. It's about acknowledging the harm that's been done and taking responsibility for it. It's about ensuring that the people who suffered are seen, their voices heard, and their pain recognized. For Ukraine, the cost of the war has been devastating. Lives lost, communities shattered, and a nation left to rebuild from the ruins. Accountability must begin with those who orchestrated the conflict, who weaponized propaganda and manipulated people like Alexander into fighting a war they didn't understand. But it cannot stop there. Justice demands that every individual involved confront their role, however small, in the machinery of war. Alexander's story serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of moral complacency. His reluctance to take responsibility, his insistence that he had no choice, mirrors the broader failure of societies to question the systems that lead to conflict. The war in Ukraine, like all wars, didn't begin with soldiers on the battlefield. It began with the decisions of leaders, the silence of enablers, and the willingness of ordinary people to look the other way. But reconciliation requires more than just assigning blame. It requires creating pathways for those like Alexander to confront their actions and make amends. This doesn't mean excusing their behavior. It means giving them the tools to understand the harm they've caused and the courage to face the consequences. For Alexander, this could mean acknowledging his complicity not just to his captors but to the families whose lives were upended by his presence. For others, it could mean participating in rebuilding the communities they helped destroy. Justice also demands accountability from those who weren't on the front lines but who perpetuated the systems of propaganda and coercion. The recruiters who preyed on vulnerable prisoners, the media that spread lies, the commanders who saw their soldiers as expendable, all must be held to account if there is to be any hope of preventing such tragedies in the future. The interviewer closed their conversation with a pointed question. Do you believe you can take responsibility for what you've done? Not just for yourself, but for the people whose lives were destroyed by this war. Alexander's answer was hesitant, but it hinted at a growing awareness. I don't know if I'll ever make things right, he said, but I want to try. I think I have to try. In times of war, accountability is often overshadowed by the immediacy of survival and the complexity of guilt. But Alexander's story shows that it is never too late to begin the process of justice and reconciliation. His journey? From denial to reflection, from justification to a reluctant acceptance of his role, mirrors the path that societies must take to heal from the wounds of conflict. It's a path that requires courage, humility, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths. Justice is not about erasing the past, it's about learning from it. For Alexander, for Ukraine, and for the world, accountability offers a way forward, not just to rebuild what has been destroyed, but to ensure that such destruction is never repeated. In the wreckage of war, this call to accountability becomes a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is a way to begin again.